Hey, what's up, Internet? I finally went 5-0 in the Penny Dreadful League, and I figured to celebrate I would do a quick deck tech of the deck I was playing. So to start with, I'll talk about how you actually win the game. So you have these two cards, Brash Taunter and Stuffy Doll, and for our purposes, they're basically the same thing. It's a 5-mana card that, whenever it's dealt damage, deals that much damage to an opponent, and it's indestructible. So then what happens with these guys is you put an aura on them. For instance, Guilty Conscience, which says that whenever it's dealt damage, it deals that much damage to enchanted creature. So then if you have your Stuffy Doll with a Guilty Conscience on it, whenever it's dealt damage, it deals that much damage to a player. And whenever it deals that damage, it deals damage to itself, and then deals damage to a player, and then deals damage to itself, and then deals damage to a player, and just kind of does that over and over again until you win. Or alternative, and Brash Taunter is the same deal. And alternatively, you can put a pariah on it, which isn't quite as good, but basically what it says is whenever you would take damage, enchanted creature takes damage instead. So normally you can put this on a creature and it'll like buy you a turn and get rid of something your opponent controls, but if you put it on one of your indestructible creatures, whenever your opponent would deal damage to you, it deals damage to the creature. Creature's indestructible, so it doesn't die, and then deals damage to them. So they take damage instead of you, and that's not a strict you immediately win the game combo. But if they can't get rid of it and they're relying on damage to kill you, they can't win the game. So that's plan A, but we also have these one-ofs, Krenko and Angelic Destiny, which are kind of our plan B. They're both just good, useful creatures. Krenko summons 1/1s every time he attacks and gets bigger and bigger as the game goes on, so if you get him down uncontested, he can run away with the game all by himself. Angelic Destiny, kind of a similar concept. It's just a giant aura, makes one of your creatures huge, flying, and it's resilient to sorcery speed removal, which is nice. Now, obviously, they work best together because Krenko makes goblins equal to his power, and Angelic Destiny makes Krenko a lot bigger so that he can attack more often, and also gives him flying, so he's not likely to just get blocked and killed, which is one of the big problems with Krenko. Now, these are both 1/1s, but you can get them pretty often because you have a lot of ways to run through your deck. Goblin Matron can find Krenko or Brash Taunter, and Heliod's Pilgrim can find Guilty Conscience or Angelic Destiny. So the main reason for this secondary plan is just sometimes you don't have 5 mana to cast your main plan. And now the other thing you'll start to notice is that between the 4 Goblin Matrons and 4 Pilgrims and 7 Stuffy Doll type effects and 7 Guilty Conscious type effects, we have a ton of redundancy. So a lot of the time you can just cast your Pariahs just to get rid of a creature, cast your Brash Taunters just as like a good blocker. And these tutor creatures also put a body in the way of your opponent, which can be really relevant. So this is where this deck's real strength starts to appear, which isn't the combo itself, but rather the ridiculous amount of redundancy you have and the fact that all of your combo pieces are also just roadblocks. They just do, like, they're pretty mediocre combo pieces and pretty mediocre removal, but you just have so much of it. Okay, so we have this super consistent combo and this backup plan for if we don't have 5 mana, but what's the rest of the cards in the deck? Well, they're mostly just killing creatures and generating mana. Well, I'll break that into 2 sections. We have our control cards and our mana. So aside from Guilty Conscience killing creatures, Pariah killing creatures, we also have Fire Prophecy to kill creatures and run through our deck to get rid of maybe excess Stuffy Dolls we don't want in our hand, or excess lands. Revitalize just gains life and you draw a card. We're going to be using Guilty Conscience to get rid of creatures, which means we're actually going to be taking a lot of damage while we're doing that, so a little extra life gain is nice for that. Also, it's super good against burn. Sweltering Suns is our sweeper of choice. The double red mana is pretty hard to play in this deck, but 3 damage is a lot better than 2. In previous versions I've used Pyroclasm, but I think I like Sweltering Suns better, and obviously cycling is nice. And then for mana, we have Everflowing Chalice and Cloud Post for ramp. And these cards, they can generate a ton of mana, but we don't actually need that. We're just trying to get 1 point of ramp before we get to 5 mana, so we can go off on turn 4. And then we have Iganjo Castle, randomly gives you a benefit with Krenko, not much downside. Glimmer Post works with Cloud Post. Mountain Plains, Temple of Triumph, Urza's Factory. One thing I really wish is that we could run more of these. In previous versions, I ran more, but with Sweltering Suns, I felt like I needed to add an extra mountain. This basically is our late game. It's like the only thing we have to actually be a mana sink for Cloud Post and Everflowing Chalice. It's the factory. Um, and it's a pretty good late game, especially considering that like we have just a ton of removal, and like if they don't have some way to interact with us, we just combo off. Then in the sideboard, we have stuff we can search for. Like we prefer Goblin Crater Maker as our anti-artifact hit because we can search for it with the Matron. Vexing Shusher, good against counterspell decks. Arms Dealer, I might take this card out if I play this deck again. It's very useful for like bolting. It's kind of a mana sink because we can use Goblin Matron to search up another Goblin Matron to search up another Goblin Matron to search up Arms Dealer, and then we have a ton of removal spells in case our opponents have like Glory Bringers and stuff. But we just have so much removal in the main deck, we don't really need it. Goblin Settler, you can kind of do a Ponza thing with this card, but it's really there to just destroy single target problematic lands against like Cloud Post decks or anything that's trying to actually use lands as like an engine. You're not really playing this to like knock your opponent off their colors or whatever, unless there's some type of really specific deck that you want to do that for. Chain to the Rocks, this card is actually why we run Iganjo Castle, but we don't run the red legendary land, because we want to run mountains. One thing I might change about this deck in the future is that Chain to the Rocks is just so strong that I might run it in the main deck. It's better than Guilty Conscience for getting rid of big creatures. It is a ton of extra removal, and we have a bunch of ways to stop our opponent's creatures already, but it's just so efficient that it feels like cheating almost or something when you hit it like a Metalworks Colossus. Deafening Silence for Storm. So I should mention that Deafening Silence is kind of like, I generally prefer Nevermore in these types of decks, but because you have all these Cloud Posts and Glimmer Posts and stuff, it's a little hard to get the double white to play that. So instead we have Deafening Silence because it only costs the one white. It's really good against Storm, but I prefer Nevermore because it's also useful against decks like Hermit Druid and just combo in general. I don't really think you need specific anti-Storm cards. It's not that much stronger than the other combo decks in the format. Then Flame Speaker's Will. This is an interesting one because it's really bad artifact hate, but it's also, you can just fetch it with Heliod's Pilgrim, and sometimes the 1/1 can be relevant, especially if you have Brenzo. But that's pretty much the only reason for that card, because you can fetch it with Heliod's Pilgrim. Other than that, it's just straight up worse than every other artifact hate. I could definitely see a case for replacing this with something else, but I like it. Soul Guide Lantern, graveyard decks are not that strong right now, but because we don't have Nevermore to fight through decks like Hermit Druid and the various World Gorger Dragon decks, we need something else to beat the combo decks that aren't Storm, because that Deafening Silence isn't really good against. Tattoo Ward was a surprise all-star. In one of my matches, the protection from enchantments was actually pretty relevant. The reason we run it is it's a tutorable way to destroy enchantments, but it turned out to be a lot stronger than I thought. Irosa's Blessing, interesting card. By all rights, it's straight up worse than all of our other removal, but it does one thing that our other removal spells don't do, and that's destroy Planeswalkers. And Planeswalkers are not like so much a part of this format as they are of pretty much every other format in Magic. But sometimes when you're playing against Yokelhaups or something like that, they can stay put, and it really determines the fate of the game if it gets to live or not. And you don't have a ton of ways to beat them down. Like sure you can like get Angelic Destiny off sometimes, but if you're on the Stuffy Doll plan, you generally won't have any removal that can hit Planeswalkers. And this sometimes that one removal spell that does that can be important. So overall, I would describe the deck as being really, really strong against anything that's relying on lots of creatures, whether that be like creature-based combo decks or aggro decks or mid-range decks. But it's really bad against High Tide. And also not wonderful against control. Like if you're playing against a mono blue control deck, Pariah is just another card that they can counter. It's just more redundant combo pieces. But if you're against Elves, I had a game against Elves, and it felt like it was Doomblade plus Time Walk. It was ridiculous. It killed their Lord, and they had to attack into it. They had to do it eventually. So it absorbed all the damage from their attack and it killed their lord. It was just ridiculous. Um, Overall, I think the strongest aggro kind of decks against this are actually decks like aristocrats because they can go around pariah and they are also just really fast and hard to interact with because they have stuff that keeps coming back from the graveyard. So that means you rely on Guilty Conscience quite a lot. But also Guilty Conscience doesn't kill their creatures because they can just elect not to attack and get other types of value out of their creatures. Of course, you can still beat them with like your regular creature removal, but it's not as amazing a matchup as it might be, as it might seem. Other decks that are kind of annoying are things which can kill the Brash Taunters and Stuffy Dolls. Like white decks can get rid of it with Chain to the Rocks types of effects, for instance, like Oblivion Rings and stuff. And black decks actually Zombies has negative X effects right now, and that's really dangerous for these guys because you're really investing a lot of mana into them, and if they don't live, it can be quite a problem. Of course, later in the game you have the option to play a Taunter and Guilty Conscience and a Burn spell on the same turn, but usually if you're playing against something fast like Zombies, you won't get the chance. But against decks like Elves, White Meanies, Knights, this deck just wipes the floor with them. That's what it's designed to do. If you check out the matches, that's pretty much how it went. There were some really strange matches, such as actually a mirror match with another guy who tried. It was the modified version of one of my previous decks, and I actually beat him by putting Pariah on his Brash Taunter. And it turns out that that causes an infinite loop, but because he also had a Guilty Conscience on it, he ended up having to put spells on the stack, so that meant that if he kept the loop going, he would time out, and I could just F6 and keep the loop going. It was just really strange. And then there was stuff like I played against an Aristocrats deck, which I think this was a bad matchup. I think Aristocrats actually beats this deck most of the time. But he had a Worship, and I had to keep playing around that. And there was always the question of, like, I could Guilty Conscience my Stuffy Doll and try and do infinite damage. What actually happens when you try and do infinite damage to an opponent who has Worship out? I have no idea. Thankfully, I didn't actually need to find that out. I beat him without that, but yeah, it was some really good, interesting, weird, engaging games. And it's a pretty strong deck. I'd say it's a solid tier 2. It's not amazing against everything in the format if your removal isn't good against it. But also, a lot of people play aggro decks. Aggro decks are some of the most successful decks in the format. This is a way to beat them. So yeah, it's definitely a deck I would suggest picking up if you're interested. It has a certain amount of room for innovation. If you can find a way to shove in another Urza's Factory, maybe the fourth Pariah, and change the arms dealer out for something else. Find some way to put more change in the rocks. Maybe find a way to use Nevermore with better mana. There's definitely room for improvement in this deck, and when I say it's pretty powerful, I went 5-0 with it, and then one of my previous runs was 4-1. So I feel like this isn't a complete fluke. It's definitely a solid deck in the right meta. If you think the meta is just going to be like decks that win by attacking with lots of little creatures, this is a really solid option. Anyways, thanks for listening. My voice is getting tired, so I will talk to you later.